Ever wonder what makes really creative people tick? Where do their ideas come from? What keeps them energized? What kinds of things get in their way? Is their life really as much fun as it looks from the outside? Hello, I'm your host, Lily Pierpont, and this is ArtStorming, a podcast about how new ideas come to life and become paintings, sculptures, plays, or poems, performances, or collections. Each episode, I'll chat with a guest from the arts community and explore how the most creative among us stare down a blank canvas or reach into the void and create something new. Today, I'm ArtStorming with collector and gallerist Barry Ellsworth. His Santa Fe gallery, Ellsworth Gallery, offers an unusual pairing of Japanese antiques, primarily samurai armor, and contemporary painting, photography, and sculpture. And if that were not intriguing enough, this former president of the Santa Fe Gallery Association was trained as a painter and launched his career as an indie filmmaker. So this guy has an incredibly multifaceted perspective on the art world and how it works. In this conversation, we'll learn how he came to combine such seemingly disparate styles of art and how he leverages his experience as a creator and a collector to guide his clients in selecting pieces of their own, as well as how he supports emerging artists in their careers. We'll even get a hint of what might be next on his art journey. Okay, so I'm talking to Barry Ellsworth, and Barry has a gallery in Santa Fe known as Ellsworth Gallery. And my first question to you, Barry, is what inspired you to combine museum-quality Japanese antiques with contemporary?
Well, I was interested in Japanese antiques, specifically Japanese armor of the samurai and their accoutrements, for a long time, since I was about 12 years old. And I had a little bit, and I was working in the film industry and left New York, taught in that industry for a while, but then I was in New Mexico and I started to collect more and then started to deal Japanese antiques. Did that for a few years in Paris. And when I returned to the US, I was looking for a space to do that in, and I found a wonderful gallery space, and it had enough room to also accommodate contemporary art. And I was feeling like it was very interesting to work in this vein of masterpieces that were made centuries ago, but that I also wanted, maybe partly from my own training as an artist, to work with living artists. So we did the two things. We had sort of a double-barreled space. One side is Japanese antiques, one side is contemporary paint, mostly painting and sculpture. And we do many Native American contemporary artists, but also some other artists. And although the spaces are separate, we often see there's a kind of a resonance between the work, between contemporary work and Japanese antiques.
Say more about what are the similarities?
Well, in some sense, I think of the Japanese as being sort of the progenitors of modernism. Japan was a closed society until 1868, and when it opened up in the late 19th century, a lot of Americans, and particularly Europeans, went, visited Japan, saw art that they had never really seen before. Art that had aspects of modernism, art where negative space was as important as the object of the picture, art that had a certain, usually asymmetrical aesthetic, and this really appealed. And a lot of Impressionists, particularly in France and in Europe, but also in the United States, actually started to collect Japanese art, started to quote Japanese art in their work. So I feel there's a lot in the modernist aesthetic that really comes from Japan.
Well, when you first opened the gallery, how did you decide which contemporary artists? Were you drawing specifically from the Santa Fe community or New Mexico, or were you open to the whole United States, or how did you choose?
When I started out, my idea was to bring art to Santa Fe from many different places. And in fact, the first two artists I exhibited, one was a painter I've known for many decades named Elise Ansel, who's a wonderful painter based in Maine and who shows around the world. The other was a photographer named Maritza Wild, who's based in New York. But as I did that and I showed their work and we had successful shows with them and had repeat shows as well, but I started to really become aware of what a rich vein of artists there is in New Mexico. So I started to feel that rather than importing art, I did a little more of artists from outside and group shows, but rather than importing art, why not offer the very rich art scene, and particularly the Native American art scene that is in place in New Mexico?
Do you feel like the fact that you're a painter, and we'll get into that in just a second, the fact that you started off as a painter, does that influence the choices that you make and who you show?
I think it probably does. I was a figurative painter, and I would say that I gravitate towards figurative work. We've shown some purely abstract work, but most of what we've shown is figurative, which is not to say realistic, but is to say that there is some element in the picture that can be identified as an object from the real world. And I do gravitate towards figurative work. And also, I think I sort of understand painting and the process from doing it. And for me, of course, the work is important, but it's also the artist. And is this somebody that I'm interested in as a person, as an artist, and somebody I want to work with? And what is their process? I've always liked paintings where I feel that there's a certain struggle in the painting. I feel that it's not just an easy dash off. It's not something where the artist has come up with a formula. It's something where the artist is engaging in some sort of struggle to express something, and we can feel that in the painting, and that's what makes the painting come alive for me. So I think that is what informs, from my experience as a painter, my selection of artists.
Which is interesting because the antiques on the other side, there isn't really much of an expression of the individual at all. These are pieces that were maybe made for an individual, but the craftsmanship is very tight. There's no room for struggle.
That's correct on much of it. The Japanese certainly are and were a very traditionally oriented crafts society. There is creativity within the bounds, and sometimes a little outside of the bounds of the established craft. You do, however, see, particularly in Japanese painting, particularly in brush painting, this is a medium, painting with brushes and ink, in which there are no corrections. And many great
Are you referring to Sumi?
Sumi,
yeah.
Yeah. Many great brush paintings were probably executed in a matter of minutes, but that was on top of years and years and years of study, and certainly discarding many things that didn't work out. So, although they may be within a tradition, there's something very improvisational about them, an improvisation that's built on a great deal of experience. So I don't know that it's necessarily true that all of the Japanese art we represent is sort of rigidly traditional.
Having had no experience, do you think that helped you create a better gallery?
I don't know. I actually, I started dealing Asian art 20 years ago, and I had the opportunity to move to Paris and work with a very established dealer there for about 3 years, and I had a private gallery in Paris. And that was a different business because it's a very small group of top collectors. It's not as much of a marketing business. You're not necessarily creating a market for your artists because the market exists. So you're basically trying to acquire pieces that will be appealing to the collectors whose taste you understand. So I had quite a few years' experience in that before I opened a brick and mortar street front gallery. A street front gallery, particularly when you're representing emerging artists, as we mostly do, these are not artists who people are widely aware of, Googling their names. So you have to sort of create a market, educate a clientele, and create a taste for these artists. And that is something that was a new challenge for me. I don't have a background in marketing, and I did bring in some people, of course, to work with me on it. But it's a very different business. It's almost kind of the inverse model of the Japanese antique art business.
So you just answered my next question, which were the similarities and the differences. But go a little bit more into the difference between being a collector dealer versus somebody who is helping educate the public about emerging artists.
I think in both cases you're using your taste and you're developing your taste. I always thought it was a great privilege in the contemporary part of the gallery to be able to really stay with these works for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, however long a show was up. There's a big difference between living with a work and seeing it briefly. And you start to see new layers of the work, and you start to understand the works that really stay with you, the works that after weeks or even months, you continue to return to and find something new in. So I think, as a collector, you live with pieces. And I think by living with pieces, you gain a deeper understanding of them that may allow you to better orient a client who's only seeing the piece for maybe a few minutes or a few hours to what is important about the piece and what will give it staying power in the client's collection.
Okay, so the pieces that you own yourself, how did you come to select those, both on the contemporary side and on the Asian antique side?
Well, on the contemporary side, I did have this opportunity to sit with the work quite a bit. And I noticed which pieces really resonated with me. Those might not necessarily be the best pieces. Other pieces might resonate with other people. But when I really fell in love with a piece, then I would acquire it from the artist, and that also helped the artist and builds my collection. In the Japanese realm, it's kind of a similar thing. Certain pieces speak to me personally a little more. Some pieces have a greater sort of historical resonance to them. You can feel the kind of visceral existence of these pieces in history, some a little less. Doesn't make one better than the other, but sometimes you just relate energetically to a certain piece, and you want to keep it, at least for a while. As collectors, of course, we're really just custodians. I mean, these pieces will survive beyond us. So to keep a piece is really just to keep it a little longer and want to enjoy it a little longer before it goes out again in the world and someone else becomes the custodian.
So does that feel like slightly less risky to buy an antique piece versus a new piece? Because you just sort of know it's going to have staying power?
It's a different, if it's an antique piece, or it would be true of contemporary art by very established artists, there is a pretty set value. And that value is usually largely pegged to auctions. So we can assume that when a piece goes at auction at Christie's or Sotheby's or another auction house, the price that's paid for it is the market price, because that's what we'll say at least two people were willing to pay that price or slightly less. So we can look at those auction results and say, this is the probable value of this piece. When we're talking about emerging artists, we really don't have much of an auction history. We may have a little bit of a sales history. So emerging art is much more speculative. Consequently, it's a much better value. It's usually much less expensive. You could have bought Jean-Michel Basquiat when I lived in New York in the 1980s for a matter of, hundreds or thousands of dollars that would now be worth many, many millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. So there's a great potential for appreciation. But of course, many emerging artists, even very good ones, don't reach those kind of levels of sales. So I really feel like in buying art, whether it's contemporary or an older piece, you really have to buy something that you want to live with. It's sure you can see it as an investment. It's probably a lower risk and lower upside investment in an antique or established piece, and a higher risk, higher upside investment with an emerging artist. But really, in the end, it's your own taste. And a lot of collecting is about discovering your taste and learning to act on your taste and having the confidence that what you like, you're seeing a value that other people will see.
So when auction items come up and you're scrolling through, and mostly you buy your art through the Japanese market, is that correct? I mean, the samurai art, that's coming through Japanese channels mostly. And when you're seeing those pieces, when pieces come up for sale, how do you connect with one? How do you know it's something that's worth investigating?
So what you're pointing out, our contemporary business, sometimes we purchase pieces out of our own shows, but it's a primary market business. The work, by and large, has never been sold before. It's fairly newly created, and it's represented, as most galleries do, on consignment. So the artist consigns the work to the gallery, and if the work sells, the gallery takes a commission and returns the rest to the artist. The secondary market, which is any market for work that has already been sold. So if you were talking about Impressionists or you were talking about Greek, statues, you're talking a secondary market. In our secondary market, which is the Japanese market, we buy privately from collectors. We buy at auction, both. We've bought from big collections in Europe, big old collections in Europe, and we also buy, of course, in Japan. A lot of that is connections, and we don't always see the piece in person. So your question was, how do you kind of sense that energy of the piece? Sometimes we're judging from photographs, and, it's hard to sense energy from photographs. You can some, but there also are a lot of other points that we're evaluating a piece on, the quality of the workmanship, if it's genuine or not, the age, a lot of things like that are apparent without being with the piece in person. However, I think that to truly understand particularly antique artwork like this, it's very important to hold it. For anyone who wants to understand this work, it's good to look at books. It's good to go to museums, but if you have the opportunity to actually pick the piece up and hold it, you understand it on a level that you can't through photographs or even through seeing it through a pane of glass in a museum exhibit.
So when people come into the gallery, do you engage with them and interact such that they can hold the pieces? Is that part of your strategy for educating them?
It depends on the piece, its fragility and how it's mounted. It's not always, possible to dismount the piece and have the person hold it. But if it's possible for us to do it, and if the person has a serious interest, we're not averse to it. It's not prohibited.
So do you feel the same is true with a new piece of artwork? Is holding a piece or different from, certainly seeing it in person is different from seeing a photograph of it.
Very true. And that has to do, with scale, with texture, so many things that can't really be conveyed in a little JPG image that you're seeing on a computer screen. I feel it less with contemporary work. It doesn't have the history for me. I suppose, holding a sculpture and getting a sense of its weight and mass. You don't usually hold a painting. They all feel pretty much the same. So I don't think that is as essential to understanding contemporary art. But I do think it's important to see the art in person. I mean, it's also fun to buy, and we buy art without ever seeing it. But in terms of educating yourself and understanding the piece, the scale, the texture, all of that isn't really completely conveyed in a photograph is important to understand.
So you said it was helpful for you and inspirational for you to meet the artist in terms of being a gallerist and representing the artist. How important do you think it is for a collector to meet the artist?
I think many collectors want to meet the artist, and I think artists often, would like to meet their serious collectors. I think, I don't know how important it is for them in terms of understanding the art. It may be. Different artists are, have different levels of communication about their art. Some artists don't really want to talk much about their art. They feel that the art is there, it's on the wall, and you make of it what you make of it. Other artists have many things to say. So, we certainly organize events where collectors and just the general public have an opportunity to meet the artists and hear what they have to say about their work and about their process. And, I think the greater the engagement, everyone is enriched by that.
So now that you've been in the business you've had the gallery about 10 years or so?
That's correct, yeah.
I've
actually had, including the gallery in Paris, 20 years, but...
Oh, okay. So the contemporary side of the business is
about 10 years.
About 10 years. Any sort of ideas about going back to painting yourself?
I would love to. My daughter is a painter, and I love to sort of live vicariously through her painting, which is excellent. I would like to get back to it, not so much because I want to forge a career in painting, but because the process of making with my hands I find very satisfying. I feel like it's difficult in this world with a lot of work that we do on computers and very fast-moving world to make that kind of space for creation. And as much as I would like to create a product, I would like to have a little more of that space in my life. And if I did, something I might do with it is to paint again.
And what have you gleaned from having shown contemporary art? How has that influenced what you might want, how you might approach a canvas now versus when you were in school?
I feel like sometimes the more art you see, the more difficult it can be to actually put a brush on a canvas. So, and of course, it's ultimately an extremely personal process, and for it to be authentic, it really has to be coming from somewhere deep within the painter. And I think particularly in this day and age when visual art, there's a great amount of it. And just images in general. We're barraged by images on the internet. There are a great number of people creating art, a great number of venues to see art in. I almost think to some extent it might be helpful for me personally to disconnect a little bit from that visual stream in order to create. In terms of the artists that I've exhibited and worked with, I think it's interesting to see everyone's process. Nobody's process is exactly the same. Just as it's a deeply personal expression, it's a very personal process. So people have really different ways that they create, that bring them to creation. And it's been really interesting to see that through the artists I've worked with. And I really have deep respect for all of them. And there is no one path.
Do you think you could get back to that beginner's mind that you had when you were 18, 19, 20 painting?
I would like to. I think I actually, when I was 18, 19, 20, I think I thought I knew a lot. I'm not so sure I had beginner's mind. I'm not sure I knew as much as I thought I knew. But I did, to some extent, I did have a certain beginner's mind. I think it's difficult to get back there. We're all so wise, and maybe a little too wise. And I meditate some, and I not just in terms of creating art, but just in general in my life, seek to open that up for myself.
And would it be to sell your work, or would it be just a personal expression? What do you see as the differences between those two things?
Well, that's a little further down the road than I am, but I think I would never be opposed to selling my work. And the reason is not just the money. Of course, the money is important, but I think it's important for most artists for their work to go out in the world, to live in other people's lives, in other people's homes. And I think this gives it kind of refuels the creative process. Sometimes I see artists who really don't want to let go of their work. And sometimes that gets expressed by them sort of maybe pricing it a little bit higher than they can really sell it. And I feel like that can put a stopper on the the sort of great circle, the great wheel of creativity, where you put things out and things come back. So I would say, yes, if I were painting quite a bit, I would like to sell my work as I did when I was younger. And, or even in some instances, perhaps gift my work. But I would want to see it have a life outside of the studio.
So for you, it wouldn't just be a personal exploration in the medium of paint. It's something that you feel like has to be a conversation with the outside world.
I think it's first a personal exploration and a conversation with oneself. And I think it's important to initiate a conversation with the outside world only when the artist is ready and the work is ready to do that.
Do you think you'd still do figurative work?
It's my tendency, yes. There would be a certain sea change in me for me to do abstract work.
And you used to work from live models, didn't you?
Yes, and that was very important to me. I painted a lot of my friends a lot, and I really, I'm not sure that I'm a little more interactive than the sort of model of the artist just alone in their studio. I like bringing other people into the studio. I wasn't doing academic work, so I wasn't doing portraits that were necessarily recognizable as the people I was painting, but I was using their energy and their appearance as the genesis for a piece of art. And for me, that created a conversation that was really meaningful, and I think I might go in that direction again if I started painting again, just because I know that that's a fruitful avenue for me.
Having done the painting, a little bit about film, which I want to hear about in just a minute, the dealing and the collecting, of all of those, which do you feel is most native to you?
I don't know. They're all sort of a part of the same stream to me. And they engage different parts of my personality. So I don't know that one is more native.
Would you encourage emerging artists to experience being in the gallery business, or do you think that those have two pretty separate tracks?
I would really encourage emerging artists who wish to have a professional career to engage pretty extensively with the gallery world. I think it would be a very good idea, and many young artists do, to work in a gallery, often as a preparator, but particularly in sales in a gallery. I think artists don't often understand the full scope of what a gallery does and what a gallery offers. And I think some artists don't necessarily understand how to approach a gallery. I think particularly as we get into a very digital social media age, the artist-gallery relationship is very much a partnership. So, there's maybe an older model where the artist toils alone in their studio and a gallery sort of discovers them and comes and picks the paintings up. And from then on, it's just the gallery, and the gallery sells their work. But I think a lot of galleries now are looking for artists who are going to contribute to getting the work out in the world, who have active social media profiles, and who understand to some extent the gallery's role and the art sales process. I don't think that, disdaining or resenting the gallery, its commission, is probably particularly a winning strategy for artists. Artists now don't have to have a gallery. They can work and sell directly through social media. And if that model works better for them, then I think that's something they should do. But yeah, I think it's important to understand the entire business, just as I think it's very good for gallerists to understand the process of making art.
So how would you recommend that an artist stay kind of in their I'm going to say pure magic, so that not to get too pressured by the demands of the marketplace versus, what is in them to be expressed? That's, as a gallerist, I think it would be hard for you to sell your own work, for example, and find that line between those two spaces, selling and making.
Yes, I think there's a reason that in many areas, particularly creative areas, there is a separate role for the creator and the person who brokers the relationship between the creator and the audience. It is difficult to represent your own work, although some people certainly can do it and enjoy doing it. We have had some artists who actually have been in the gallery and reacted with clients and sold their own work. And the clients also often really like it. They get to meet the artist. I'm sorry, I lost it. What was the question?
The question is finding the line between taking guidance from the gallery as to what sells versus, following your own trajectory.
I think this is always a challenge for professional artists. And I know that you've interviewed a couple of professional artists whose work I'm familiar with. And I have great respect for this. I think for them to keep their work fresh and alive and personal. And at the same time, they have very established client bases who are expecting a certain type of work. They have a brand. And it becomes very difficult for them to make radical shifts in the kind of work that they do. So I think for them to remain engaged and yet produce consistent work is, a real challenge. And, there certainly are some people who just churn out a certain formula work, and that can be very, successful from a market point of view because it's a known quantity. But often the work becomes kind of dead. And it's not something that's very interesting to me. But the artists who can really stay the course with a particular vision and keep it fresh. I think it's a lot like acting. When I was in the film business, we were making movies. It's not like stage acting. There often are many, many, many takes. And the really good actors could come in and do this consistent technical work. They had to hit the same marks for the focus of the camera. They had to be doing that technically. They had to be consistent, and yet they had to be fresh. They had to be delivering their lines and interacting with the camera in a way that seemed completely spontaneous and was spontaneous. I think they had to evoke a spontaneity to do it. So I would think that might be kind of similar to the challenge for a professional artist working within a very established brand and keeping it creative and fresh.
Well, let's use that as a segue into your experience in the film industry, which was your first professional career. And say a little bit more, you just started to say a little bit, but say more about the difference between the 7 arts and the fine arts.
Yeah, well, I studied painting in college, but I wasn't very excited by the art program I was in. It was very small and very oriented towards 1950s abstract expressionism, which wasn't exactly the vein I was working in. And it felt like a little bit of a backwater to me. And I had always also made movies using my stepfather's Super 8 camera and things like that. And I met some people who were in another very small but much more alive program, in my feeling, in college, who were making movies. And so I made some films with them in college. And then after I graduated, I went and I painted for about a year. And I was feeling kind of stuck. And a couple of my friends had gone to New York, and they were working in the film industry there. And they encouraged me to come and work with them, which I did. And we went and produced a number of, low-budget experimental films. Maybe not experimental isn't the right word. We called them experimental narratives. They were narrative films, but they weren't, emulating Hollywood. And some of those got a lot of attention, and it was very exciting. And I thought very alive. So,
were you on the creative end of the field? I know at some point you were filming. On the behind the camera.
So I started out as a cinematographer. I was shooting films, particularly for a good friend of mine who's now become an important director named Todd Haynes. Shot and collaborated on a number of his films. And that was kind of the natural thing for me because it's a visual part of the medium. And I enjoyed that a great deal. After I moved to New York, a while after that, I founded a production company and I started being more on the production end, which is more of the business, promotion, organizational end. And I didn't really, I wasn't as fed by that as I was by cinematography, by being the camera person on a film.
Was that more like being a gallerist to being a cinematographer?
Yes, under much higher pressure. And, I was working with people who were very gifted in that, and which was wonderful. I learned a great deal. But I had a desire to reconnect with something creative. And as I was in film, the natural tendency was to want to direct. And I did direct some films. And I realized through the process of directing those, I really got a respect for the medium of narrative filmmaking. And I worked with some people who were very talented in it. And I slowly came to realize that I really didn't have a mastery of all the components of that art form, which is a very, very complex art form, a very, very complex context in which to be creative. And I really realized other people were doing it better than me. So it was time for me to step aside.
And is that when you decided to go deeper into collecting?
Yes, I left New York for a number of reasons. I taught film for a short period of time, and that's when I started collecting.
And you first started collecting when you were 12 or so, but when did you start collecting sort of as a mature collector?
Well, when I was 12, I just had bubblegum money, so I couldn't really collect. I could go to the museum. I did happen to, my father had a good friend who owned a suit of armor and died tragically young, and I did manage to acquire that suit of armor from his widow. So I did have that one thing that always stood in my hallway. But when I left film and I got into collecting again, I had some more resources. And, the availability of pieces had become much greater because of the internet and things like that. There was really a lot more available. So I just started shopping.
And you got better, or you got more confident, or how did you decide to keep going? I mean, that can get pretty intense.
Well, collecting is an addiction. So most collectors don't have a choice. They probably only stop when they die or run out of money. But
when did you sell your first piece?
I sold my first piece in San Francisco about 20 years ago.
And did that fuel the addiction?
Yes, it did. I mean, it's fun to, and again, collecting is a custodianship. So you acquire a piece, you live with it, you learn about it, you feel it out. And after a while, you've sort of learned what you can from that piece. And it's time for that to go on to someone else who can learn from it. And you maybe want to acquire a new piece that you can learn something new from.
And what's the relationship between collecting, say, something like armor and collecting contemporary art pieces in terms of that metabolic process of owning and then releasing?
Well, collecting armor, and this is probably true of any established decorative arts category, you have a small number of very serious big collectors, and they tend to compete with each other, often in a friendly manner, but there's a whole dialogue that you have with other collectors who appreciate all the finer points, and there's a kind of agreed upon hierarchy of what's the rarest, the most interesting, and everything can be sort of placed within that hierarchy. I think it's a reason it also makes it sort of easier to know what you can then later sell. When you're dealing with contemporary art, it really is much more subjective, So I really think you fall in love with a piece, and it's not necessarily because it's the rarest piece or, made by the most famous person or whatever. Of course, in contemporary art, if it was made by the most famous person, you're talking huge amounts of money anyway. But it's a much more personal decision. And I think, you might have another collector or another person come over who appreciates what you bought, but it's not really their taste. It's not a piece that they're not sort of like, this is amazing. I wish this was in my collection. It might happen, but it's much more personal.
Well, I wonder if that's how the contemporary art market was hoping things would go. That would be kind of a more closed circle, that there'd be more agreement as to what was valuable and what's not valuable.
Well,
to a certain extent, at blue chip level, that has happened.
At the high end, At the high end of the contemporary art market, that functions a lot like it's a very established market. It's a primary, but also largely secondary market. And, because people are trading on certain names and things like that, it is a very predictable market. It's a trophy market, and often secondary markets are trophy markets. If you have a Leonardo or a Basquiat, a lot of people are going to be impressed by that. People are going to understand its commodity value. It's a commodity market. If you have a work by an unknown artist, people aren't necessarily going to be impressed or feel like you must be a very wealthy, successful person to own that work. It's going to be more just an expression of what you like and find important.
So it must be interesting to have kind of both of those sides of your collecting, in the sense that you can be in a pool where other collectors know the value of what you have and you can sort of feel like the big fish, versus the contemporary side where you can just buy what you love without any concern for if anybody else values it.
Yes, that's true. And I think that's in a way how one has to buy contemporary art by emerging artists. You're not buying it because that other people are going to be impressed, or they're going to want to buy it, or, you're going to make some huge profit someday. You could, but it's really a very personal expression.
Well, given recent events in the art market, there was just a lawsuit against Sotheby's for very large, potentially art fraud. I don't know that much about the details, but it's something to do with the Russian oligarch. But how do you think the market's changing at that level?
At the blue chip level? Well, the truth is I'm just an observer like anyone else. But, at that level, there's such huge amounts of money involved that there are a lot of opportunities for, it's a very unregulated market, not always a very transparent market. And there are opportunities for, abuse, or what might be perceived as abuse. It's that case hinged on sort of the fine line between buyer beware and seller responsibility. So what do you perceive as the seller responsibility as a gallerist when you have a client that walks in? Well, I think as a gallerist, you have a responsibility to honestly represent things. You have a responsibility to do your due diligence. You can advise a client, but in the end, it's their choice. I might like a piece and they might not. Yeah. They might like a piece and I might not. So, I guess there isn't nearly the kind of issue of provenance where the piece hasn't changed hands. It's not a secondary market. It's a primary market. So it's a much cleaner. That's correct. In primary market, the artist is usually delivering the art to the gallery, so there isn't a question of who made the art, where has it been, is there a clean chain of title. In antiques, you sometimes have issues of forgery. As a gallerist who's a specialist in that category, I'm pretty good at recognizing that. So obviously, I can protect clients from that in a way that they might not be able to protect themselves.
If they're buying direct.
Yes, if they weren't buying through me.
And how do you manage artist expectations in terms of thinking that they are going to be the next Basquiat?
I don't know too many artists who think they'll be I'm sure Basquiat didn't think he'd be the next Basquiat. Well, he knew he'd be Basquiat because he was Basquiat. But, but I think artists' expectations are those. It is important to manage those. I think I probably would avoid working with artists who I think have unrealistic expectations. With emerging artists, it's rare to sell out a show. And I think that sometimes the most difficult expectations to manage are mid-career artists who have had sort of greater success in the past than they might currently be able to have. It's not usually because the quality of their work has declined, but sometimes the market has shifted. And particularly because the market is so much broader now, there's so many more artists competing to sell work. Sometimes artists will be disappointed if their shows don't sell as well as they might have 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And so I try to, the way I manage that really is to look for that up front. I try to find out what the artist's expectations are up front, and if their expectations seem to me to be unrealistic, it may be that we're not the best fit for them.
Yeah. So say something about beauty in general, and I'll give you a little bit of a frame for that, because we are living in a time when there is such a proliferation of art. There is just tons of art. And yet we still crave beauty in the world. How does the commodification of art and the need for beauty kind of unfold?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm a strong believer that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So I don't think I believe in an objective standard of beauty, which is why I'm always encouraging, collectors to really rely on their own sense of what they like. But that being said, and this is a difficult one to put my finger on, it is true that in a group of works by a given artist, there are better, stronger work and weaker work. I'm not sure that the stronger work is more beautiful, but there is stronger work and weaker work, and usually there's something of a consensus about it. And this is why you could look at auction results and see that two paintings in the same size and medium by the same artist might command pretty different prices. And that's because the people purchasing them feel that one is a stronger work. Artists have good days and bad days. And that's very hard to define, what makes work stronger. To me, the real litmus test is living with the work. I feel like if you live with the work, and if it still speaks to you after days or weeks or months of years of living with it, it's a stronger work. If it loses its appeal, if it starts to feel flat after a certain amount of time, it doesn't make it a bad work, but in a sense, it's a more superficial work. It doesn't have the same depth. So for me, it's more about depth than beauty. But
tends to be an agreement about what that depth or beauty or quality is, because the museums that are vying for a piece of work, or people that agree that this is a better piece of work or a stronger piece of work from an artist. So where do you think that those qualities come from?
Well, there does tend to be an agreement. So it is something of an objective quality that some works may have more depth and therefore be stronger than other works by the same artist. I don't really know what, I don't think you can measure it, but it does seem to be an objective quality.
Well, when I think of the fact that there might be a piece that you've lived with for a while and you loved it, and then one decides to put it on the secondary art market. And for you, it's done its job, and there might be somebody on the secondary market who sees it, and that piece could then become the next piece. And I wonder what it would feel like for a collector to let something like that slip through their fingers. Has that ever happened to you?
Well, certainly a collector who sold a Basquiat many, many decades ago probably regrets it just on a financial basis. But I don't sell a lot of contemporary art that I acquire. I'm usually pretty sure that I want to own it. And so I usually hold on to it. I do often sell antique work that's been in my collection that I am very fond of, and I have sometimes regretted selling it. I've missed the piece. I guess it's like, breaking up with somebody and then finding out that you really weren't finished with them.
Yeah, that's interesting. So have any of your really special pieces ended up in the collections of people that you know, other collectors? Yes, and a nice thing about working in the secondary market like that, there are a small number of big collectors. Often the better pieces are picked up by them and they remain available. They may not be there are some collectors who have museums that are open to the public, but you are maybe able to revisit your old love in a new environment. Context.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So just sort of thinking, you've talked about, it sounds like the collector universe is a pretty circular pattern. You buy a piece, you hold on to it, and then you let it go. There's a kind of clear cycle to that. Sounds like there's a clear cycle to contemporary art. An artist makes a piece, it goes through the gallery system, it sells or doesn't sell. As a gallerist, what is the life cycle of a gallery?
I wish I knew. Well, I think that's a complex question. A gallery is an odd hybrid of being a museum and a retail business. So in some ways, sure, the art the gallery sells is important, but also the gallery serves a big purpose in just making art available to people to see. And 95% of the people who walk through the doors of a gallery have no intention and often don't have the resources to acquire works from the gallery. So I think the gallery really exists as a public space that presents art to the public and that is subsidized by that small percentage of clients who patronize the gallery, patronize the artists, and make that public display possible.
Well, you've certainly done a magnificent job of making art available to all of us in Santa Fe. And I think if I have any other questions, we'll have to just do a follow-up interview. But that was great. Thanks very much.
Sure.
Okay. Well, thanks for joining us today. Please like and follow us on artstorming.org, where you'll find a list of our shows, a transcript of this episode with links to the guest page, as well as our other projects. ArtStorming is brought to you and supported by ArtBridge and listeners like you. Look for us on your favorite podcast platforms.